All right. Hi, everyone. Dr. Robin Chetkan here. Welcome to this Tuesday's edition of Office Hours on the NOVA classification of ultra-processed foods. So we've all been hearing a lot about ultra-processed foods in the news, and I think it's actually good. It's getting the attention it deserves because I think there's a lot of confusion about what an ultra-processed food is. And the reason this is important is some of the stuff we've been seeing in the news is about the risk of ultra-processed foods. So there's a center in Sao Paulo, Brazil. There's a group there, an epidemiology group that does a lot of great work on ultra-processing. And in fact, that's where the NOVA classification was born, if you will. It's a consortium of scientists from around the world, but some of the leaders in the movement have been in Brazil. And we have another important study from Brazil that shows that high consumption of ultra-processed foods is linked to a premature risk of death, 10.5% increased risk of dying, largely as a result of all these conditions that ultra-processed foods are linked to, things like diabetes and hypertension and autoimmune diseases, cardiovascular disease. Now, in Brazil, they eat less ultra-processed food than we eat here. In the US, it's north of 50% of the diet. Depending on what studies you read, it's somewhere around 52, 53, 55% of our diet is ultra-processed foods. And that might seem like a lot, but when we're finished with our conversation today, you'll see that that's actually probably pretty accurate. And so in addition to the risk of chronic disease and the risk of premature death, what other risks are there to these foods? Well, I talked, I think it was last office hours, about cognitive decline and the gut. And so that's a good one to go back and check out if you missed it. And I talked about two things that are associated with a significant decrease, premature decrease in cognitive decline. Of course, we're all going to have a decrease in cognition as we age, but this sort of accelerated decrease in cognitive decline. One was antibiotics and how antibiotic use, that was a Nurses' Health study linked to the equivalent of aging your brain 3 to 4 years, significant antibiotic use in middle age. And the other was this study looking at high consumption of ultra-processed foods, and they found that if 25% of more or more of your diet was ultra-processed foods, that was linked to about a 25 to 28% cognitive decline. So we want to keep our bodies healthy and we want to keep our brains healthy. And so let's get right into it. Okay, so NOVA classification, group 1, it's a 1 to 4 classification. Group 1, unprocessed or minimally processed. Okay, so that would be things like a handful of almonds or an apple, things like that. Now, I do want to point out, and I made some notes because there's some things I want to make sure I don't forget. In class 1, it's unprocessed or minimally processed foods. So that would be foods that are obtained directly from a plant or animal source that undergo minimal processing. And once they're removed from nature. So let me give you an example because I made a list of lots of different examples for you. So natural foods, again, that you can clean them, you can remove unwanted parts, you can fraction them, ground them, dry them, ferment them, pasteurize them, cool them, freeze them. Other processes that may subtract part of the food but don't add anything. Okay, so like if you are talking about beans, packaged beans, you may remove some of the debris, but you're not adding anything to it. So you can subtract part of the food, but you're not adding anything, and you're not specifically adding oil, fat, sugar, salt. We're going to come back to those 4 things. So what are some examples? Packaged frozen vegetables or frozen fruit. Again, just frozen. Look at the ingredients. If it just says, banana, or no, probably not banana for frozen fruit, pineapple. So it is modified because it's frozen, but they haven't added anything to it. Okay. Bulk packaged grains like rice, pasteurized fruit juices with no added sugar. Now, I'm not suggesting that pasteurized fruit juices are fine to drink. They have a lot of sugar already and they don't have any fiber, but they are classified as group 1. So pasteurized fruit juices with no added sugar. Oat cereal. So, we eat oatmeal most mornings in our household. That is a minimally processed food if it just says rolled oats. Dried or fresh pasta. That's just made where it will just say wheat, durum flour, and water. Or polenta. Eggs, legumes. So beans, typically dried fruits, pasteurized milk, chilled meats, so a meat that doesn't have additional solution in it, poultry, seafood, meat, etc., to extend the shelf life, tea, coffee, mineral water. Now, bear in mind that I'm not saying that all type 1, all class 1 unprocessed foods are healthy or good for you. This is not a discussion about health. This is a discussion about processed foods and the classification. So within class 1, there's some foods that may be less healthy than others, right? But this is a classification for minimally or unprocessed foods. Again, so natural foods that have, they can have been cleaned, inedible or unwanted parts removed. They can be fractioned, ground, dried, fermented, pasteurized, cooled, frozen, or other processes that may subtract part of the food, but which do not add any oil, fat, sugar, salt. All right, and we went through some examples. Okay, so what do I have on my table here that is an unprocessed food? I have, and I don't do anything with any brand, so I went down to my pantry. This is Lundberg organic whole grain rice cakes, all right? And so what are the ingredients? Because everything here is just marketing, advertising, natural, organic, all this advertising. So to get to what's really going on, you got to get to the ingredients in the back. Ingredients: organic brown rice, sea salt. Okay. This actually is not a type 1. It is a type 2. And we're going to talk about type 2 in a minute. So this has sea salt added. So remember, you can subtract things for minimally processed, but you can't add. This has added salt. So this is a good segue into our group 2, which are classified as processed culinary ingredients. And important to distinguish between culinary ingredients in group 2 for when we get into group 3 and 4, where the ingredients are not added for seasoning or anything. They're really added with a particular motive of preserving, extending shelf life, etc. So processed culinary ingredients is a NOVA type 2. Oil, fat, sugar, salt can be added, but moderately. So products that are extracted from natural foods, sea salt comes from a natural food, or from nature by pressing, grinding, refining. And again, we're going to go over some examples. So these are things that are used to season foods or used in cooked foods. And if they're used in moderation, they are not considered, they don't make the food nutritionally unbalanced. So there's some sea salt in here that is probably added for 2 reasons: to give it a little bit of flavor, because it says lightly salted, and also to extend the shelf life. But it is a culinary ingredient and it is not making this food nutritionally unbalanced. Okay, so that, again, this is not an endorsement of Lundberg rice cakes, just pointing out that this is now a type 2 processed culinary ingredients. Okay, what else? I have so much stuff here. I have this oat milk. Oil-free oat milk. This is, I don't even know what brand this is, but let's look at the ingredients, okay? So again, this is just the ad on the front, and then the ingredients. This says filtered water, okay, that's class 1. Organic gluten-free oats, minimally processed. Pure organic vanilla extract made from vanilla beans, so again, that's for flavor. And Himalayan pink salt. So this also is a type 2. This is has some ingredients in there that are used processed culinary ingredients for the taste, etc., not as preservatives. And I'll contrast that, and again, I don't care about any of these brands, I'm just giving you the information. Contrast that with this oat milk. This oat milk has oat base, water, oats, low erucic acid rapeseed oil, ding, 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 we're gonna come back to that. It has dipotassium phosphate, calcium carbonate, tricalcium phosphate, sea salt, dicalcium phosphate, DHA algal oil, sodium ascorbate, tocopherols, riboflavin, etc., etc. Okay, so these are not seasonings. So this brings us to group 3. And group 3 is basically processed foods. And these are foods that are made by industry. So they're made in a factory as opposed to in a restaurant or home typically, which we see type 1, type 2. And they have added salt, sugar, oil, or other substances to preserve or make them more palatable. And usually they have more than 2 to 3 ingredients. Okay, so we kind of can contrast this one with 2 ingredients, the brown rice and the sea salt, with this one with like 7 ingredients. And again, what is the purpose of the ingredient? The purpose of the ingredients in this is to emulsify the milk so that it's nice and creamy and it doesn't separate, like if you would make oat milk or almond milk or something at home. So it's to emulsify it and to prolong the shelf life and some flavor enhancers. So this is now an industrial process. So this is a processed food. In fact, this one may be an ultra processed food depending on the amount. So what's the difference? So if we go into examples of processed foods, again, think more than 2 or 3 ingredients: canned legumes and veggies, tomato extract. I got this one here. This has been in my pantry a really long time. This is a little thing of tomato paste. It's got citric acid as a second ingredient. So again, prolonging shelf life. Fruits and syrup, bacon, canned tuna fish, salted, dried, cured meat, coconut fat, fresh cheese, on-packaged fresh bread is actually group 3. Fermented alcohol like beer and wine, but distilled alcohol like gin, etc., is ultra processed. So there you go, salted nuts and seeds where the salt is added as a preservative. So that's group 3. But really it's group 4 that we're really, group 3, not great, but group 4 are the ultra processed foods. These are industrial formulations, and by industrial, typically made in a factory. Industrial formulations made entirely or mostly from substances extracted from foods, oils, fat, sugar, starch, proteins, derived from food constituents like hydrogenated fats, or made in a lab or factory from a food substrate. And so again, the foods are grouped according to the extent of the processing and the intent of the processing. So an ultra-processed food would be an example of this corn muffin mix. Some of this stuff like has expiration dates of like 4 years ago. I don't know what it's doing. I think this was from a Thanksgiving a while ago. Okay, so here are the ingredients. Wheat flour, okay. Sugar, okay. Degermed yellow cornmeal, vegetable shortening, which is palm oil and soybean oil, malted barley flour, calcium stearate, soy lecithin, sodium acid pyrophosphate, tricalcium phosphate, ethoxylated mono and diglycerides. I went to med school. I don't know what ethoxylated mono and diglycerides are, but I do know that they're not food. Artificial flavors, dextrose, maltodextrin, acacia gum, caprylic, triglycerides, ascorbic acid. Okay, the list goes on, a long list. Thiamine mononitrate. So here's a simple rule of thumb that I recommend to my patients. Once you start to see chemical names in here, that's category 4. That's an ultra processed food. And the other thing you can think of is there, how close is this to the natural source? Like you look at a rice cake, okay, I can kind of see the rice kernels in there, right? Versus something like oats don't look like milk or almonds don't look like milk. So again, you can't get almond milk from an almond that's shelf stable. You can certainly get it, and it would be class 1 at home if you were to soak your almonds and blend them and strain them. That would still be category 1, right? But once you get into the shelf stable, it can sit on the shelf in the store for prolonged periods of time, even refrigerated, then you are now in a more processed state. So think long shelf life or longer shelf life for ultra processed and all these additional ingredients. So once you start to see these ingredients, you don't need to keep going. It's like, okay, this is not something I should be eating a lot of. And so why is this important to me as a gastroenterologist? Well, I don't want you to die prematurely, and I don't want you to have cognitive decline, but there's something else. We know that a lot of these chemicals, particularly the emulsifiers, damage the gut lining. They actually increase the intestinal permeability of the gut. And they're also detrimental to the microbiome, to the trillions of microbes, of bacteria in your gut that are there for some really important reasons. And so I was thinking about this, getting ready to come and chat with you today, because in my book, where is it? I don't have it here. The new book, The Antiviral Gut, that I should have right here. But in that book, in the chapter, one of the last chapters in the book before the plan, called The Long Haul, when I talk about long COVID, I talk about some of the complications of COVID, including things like MIS-C, multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, and we see it in adults too. And there's a study from Korea where they found that kids with multisystem inflammatory syndrome had a complication of COVID, had an increase in intestinal permeability, an increase in their gut lining, and they were seeing the virus in the bloodstream. They were seeing high levels of zonulin, which is a marker for increased intestinal permeability. And so they were making a case that an increase in intestinal permeability leads to a higher risk for MIS-C. Now, I'm not trying to draw a straight line here and say if you're feeding your kid all these things, then they're going to get MIS-C and it's all your fault. Let's be clear. There are probably multiple risk factors for why some children end up with MIS-C and some adults also. But that is one of the signs, if you will, one of the sort of clues as to why the virus is able to get into the body in this profound way in some people. And we know that that happens through the gut lining. We have data from a couple years ago, a very good study that showed that eating a diet high in these ultra-processed foods that have emulsifiers can be linked to Crohn's disease. And so you may already be genetically susceptible to Crohn's, but this could be the environmental trigger. So these foods are linked to actual real diseases and real problems. This isn't just a theoretical like, oh, these foods aren't good for you because I say so. We have data making these associations. Now, association is not causation, right? But as we start to see a highly pesticized and highly synthesized food chain, which is what we're eating here, where these foods are very synthetic. I have more stuff here, all these different things. I did bring the chocolate. Oh, the chocolate. So sad to see that most of these chocolates are ultra-processed foods, actually. This one has soy lecithin, sunflower lecithin emulsifiers in it. So just don't eat too much of it for sure. So again, as we start to see these conditions, and particularly for me as a gastroenterologist, seeing people with irritable bowel syndrome, seeing people with inflammatory bowel disease, seeing people with SIBO, leaky gut, all of these things, they are very clearly related to how we're eating, right? That's not the only thing, how we're living, we're stressed, we're not sleeping, we're not getting enough exercise, etc. But the fact that we have a very corrupted food chain is really the only way to put it. And if you haven't already, do listen to Dan Buettner's interview on Rich Roll's podcast on his new book, Blue Zone's Kitchen. I mean, even better, read the book, but do both. And I know that a lot of guests on Rich Roll's podcast, I just listen to the interview and don't buy the book. But for my interview, I want you to buy the book too, right? Rich goes long form. I think our interview is over 2 hours. And this one with Dan Buettner is over 2 hours and it's spectacular. I learned a lot about really the idea of like what American food is and what indigenous food is in this country and how it's changed and how it has really been corrupted. And Dan's leading this movement to create more blue zone cities in the US and to bring us back to a more natural way of eating. But it's a really great episode, and I learned a ton in it about these shifts. And for example, with refrigeration, we were able to prolong the shelf life of foods, etc. And a lot of the processed stuff came about because we realized really sort of midway through the 20th century that we weren't going to be able to feed everybody in America. And a lot of it was an attempt to increase, the food supply really to keep up with the demand, and hence the monoculture, etc. So it's really interesting listen. But back to this, yeah. So as a gastroenterologist, I have, in my 25 years practicing gastroenterology, I have seen a dramatic increase in some of these conditions just in my relatively short career span of a lot of these conditions. And I talk about that, how I've gone from treating things like, diverticulosis and gallstones and colon cancer to treating a lot of these sort of microscopic diseases like bacterial overgrowth and leaky gut, etc. And, you can superimpose the increase in those diseases with the increase in this kind of food that we're drinking and eating. And I mentioned drinking too. So here is this thing is called Rainier Cherry. This is dry botanical bubbly. And remember, I said fermented beer wine is group 3, but distilled is group 4. And there's a big, sober curious movement, dry movement, etc. I applaud the fact that there are a lot of these non-alcoholic beverages on the market for people who are trying to drink less alcohol or prefer not to drink alcohol. So this is a naturally flavored sparkling beverage with other natural flavors. So let me give you a word of advice. Whenever you see natural in packaging, beware. Natural usually means unnatural. So naturally flavored and natural flavors, already I have one eyebrow raised. And so when I go again to the back, I see ingredients: carbonated water, cane sugar, natural flavors, and they don't even have to say what it is, but it's anything but phosphoric acid. So again, lots of preservatives in this, and the natural flavors are, some serious chemicals typically. So even when people are trying to be healthier and saying, okay, I want to drink less alcohol, what's an alternative? It's hard. And so again, I'm not advocating that you should never have these foods or drinks, but you have to really pay attention. You have to read those labels. And I recommend trying to keep these foods to less than 10% of what you're eating. And particularly for those everyday things, like if you are using a plant milk, which can theoretically sound like a really healthy alternative, right? Like, I'm often saying dairy is for baby cows, etc. Many people are lactose intolerant. There's hormones, there's antibiotics in the milk. So it seems perfectly reasonable to then turn to a plant milk. But I want you to think about how foods occur in nature and how they turn up in the supermarket. And if you've never made almond milk, it's a great little thing to do to sort of, you get the picture there. So it's super simple. Take some almonds. It doesn't matter, roasted, raw, whatever. Take some almonds, cover them with water, soak them overnight. In the morning, pour off that water, add more water in. It doesn't matter the ratio. More water if you want it watery, less water if you want it thicker. So I usually do somewhere around a 3-to-1. 1 cup of almonds, 3 cups of water. Blend that up in a high-speed blender. I put them in my Vitamix and then strain it. I use pantyhose because why else would you have pantyhose around? But you could use a nut milk strainer thing, but you can use a t-shirt pantyhose. Strain it and you get out creamy white milk. But within a couple hours, you start to see it separate. Within minutes, actually, you start to see a watery level and a thicker level. And it separates out, and even in the refrigerator, typically within a week, 10 days, it's rancid, right? And you can tell it's not good. But yet you can go and buy the plant milk and it's creamy, and that's where the emulsifiers come in. They emulsify it like paint, like the emulsifiers in paint, similar, in some cases the same, to emulsify it and to extend the shelf life. Same thing with coconut milk. Coconut milk doesn't live in a can for months and months on the shelf on its own, right? There are things that are done to it. And those things that are done to the food to prolong the shelf life, to improve the palatability, to emulsify it, are doing things to our gut lining. So that's what's going on. Okay, let's take some questions. All right, what do we have? So throw your questions in there. Hi from South Africa, Sans, hello. Okay. Yeah, somebody says, I have IBS, help. So, irritable bowel syndrome isn't really one disease. It is a whole, if we slice up that irritable bowel syndrome pie, we see multiple things. We see lactose intolerance, we see gluten intolerance, fructose intolerance, undiagnosed parasites, we see diverticulosis, we see undiagnosed Crohn's, celiac disease, we see all kinds of things, bacterial overgrowth. So I always say if somebody's telling you have irritable bowel syndrome, it's because they didn't roll their sleeves up high enough and kind of get in there and really figure out what it is. And so how we approach it depends on what the root cause is. If you have irritable bowel syndrome because you had an infection with E. coli 4 years ago and you never fully recovered, we're going to approach that very differently from if you have lactose intolerance, or if you have diverticulosis, or if you are primarily constipated and that's why you're having symptoms. So I want you to think about IBS not as a monolith, but as a wide array of different GI symptoms that are a result of different things going on in the gut. Okay. But that being said, for whatever reason, you may have irritable bowel syndrome. Obviously, cutting down or avoiding ultra-processed foods is going to be really helpful. Okay, what else do we have? Questions, where are your questions? And this is going to be a little bit of a short one today because I'm going shopping. All right. I'm not seeing a lot of questions. Oh, here's a question. What's your advice for a new mom trying to heal her gut? Well, first of all, congratulations if you are the new mom, but maybe I see birthing moms. So maybe you're a doula or helping new moms. So congratulations to all of them too. And I think really trying to eat as healthy a diet as possible is a big part of that. And for me, that's less about what you're avoiding is important too, but it's also making sure that you're getting in a lot of the healthy stuff. So just unprocessed plant fiber from actual plants. So fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, all of those things in their most natural state is going to be really helpful, really nourishing. And one of the things I find can be helpful is making smoothies, because if somebody's a new mom, they're busy typically. And so just blending up some stuff. My typical one, I'll use a coconut water base, and then I'll usually try and do 2 greens like spinach, kale collards, spinach collards, a little bit of celery, some parsley, lemon, and then whatever fruit I have handy, usually pineapple or mango or kiwi, nectarine, stone fruit are great. Blend that up and try and have about 20 to 30 ounces of that. So I'm making sure I'm getting in all that plant fiber, fresh fruits and vegetables, but in a convenient way where I can just sort of gulp it down. So I find I've used green smoothies in my medical practice for my patients with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis with great success as a way to help my patients increase their consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables. So that's my quickie. You don't want to, I generally don't recommend plant milks in a green smoothie. I recommend a base of water, coconut water, herbal tea, green juice, and I don't recommend a lot of things that are going to make it thick like bananas and so on. So really try to keep it more on that fresh green flavor and not make it too thick or too milky. We don't want to turn it into a milkshake. Okay. How to get rid of gallstones without removing my gallbladder. Rosa, a little bit off topic, but I want to answer your question for you. So it depends. If you have gallstones, Rosa, that are actually blocking that bile duct and causing obstruction and causing your gallbladder to become really inflamed, that may be something that actually requires surgical intervention. But if the gallstones are just symptomatic, where they're causing pain, particularly after you eat, changing your diet is really key. So typically decreasing the amount of fat in your diet. And so cutting back on things like butter, on dairy, on meat, chicken, fish, all of that, eating more plants can really help with the gallbladder issues, but it depends a little bit on what's going on in the gallbladder. And again, just a reminder, this is not medical advice, just educational, so always check with your healthcare provider. Okay, how to ease the gut during Paxlovid rebound. Yes, so we're seeing a lot of Paxlovid rebound, a ton. So in addition to the nausea people often have with taking that, the rebound refers to, and so Paxlovid is one of the antivirals that's been prescribed for COVID, particularly for people at risk, older age group, underlying conditions, etc. And what we see is that there's an initial improvement, and then there can be this rebound where people get sick again. So the same things that I recommend for when you're actually sick during the rebound, and that's all in the Antiviral Gut. The whole second half of the book is the Antiviral Gut Plan. Let me run and grab that book. Hold on just a second. Okay, you see my messy desk behind me. All right, Antiviral Gut. So in the new book, The Antiviral Gut, I have a whole section on what to eat, basically, to have an antiviral gut, and both for acute illness and for post-viral symptoms, etc. So I think the recommendations in here would be really helpful for you if you're having rebound. And I'm sorry that's happening. I hope you get through that quickly. Somebody says, I thoroughly watch my diet, but struggling. Yeah, and sometimes being too rigid can be a little bit of a problem too, right? Sometimes you have to give yourself a little bit of grace with it. And, it may be, everybody's different, but it may be that you say, okay, I'm going to really pay attention breakfast and lunch, but dinner I'm going to pay a little less attention, or give yourself some leeway, but make sure you are getting that healthy stuff in. That's really important. Tapioca starch, potato starch, etc. Those are things that are not culinary ingredients, the tapioca starch. So that brings you into a category 3 and possibly a category 4, depending on what else is in there, okay? Because those are food-derived ingredients that are being used in an industrial process. Nobody's putting, tapioca starch in when they're cooking at home, typically. And so that is being put in typically as a thickener, emulsifier, etc. So that is definitely putting you in the category of processed or perhaps ultra processed, depending on what else is in there. Okay, does sugar trigger IBS? It can, depending. So if you've been on a lot of antibiotics, if you've taken acid blockers, etc., if you have a fair amount of microbial imbalance and you're eating a lot of sugar, it can definitely trigger those symptoms. So have a sweet tooth and don't know how to deal with it. One way is think about other things that are sweet, but that are not giving you as much of an insulin spike when you eat them. So think about like fruit, maybe strawberries. I like to put grapes in the freezer and have them. They kind of taste like candy, so I freeze grapes or berries sometimes. Think about things that have fiber in them as well as sugar, as opposed to something that's just more sugary. That can sometimes help. Okay. Are ultra-processed foods the only thing you avoid with stomach issues? No, that's a great question. So ultra-processed foods can definitely worsen what's going on in your gut, but there are other things to think about too. So for example, eating a diet that's too high in animal protein and not high in enough plant fiber can also create a lot of imbalance in the microbiome. It can constipate you. It can slow down gut motility. Dairy, a lot of people don't tolerate dairy. They're lactose intolerant. Some don't even know that can be an issue. Not enough fiber in general in the diet can be an issue. Also, some people are eating too much fiber in one sitting, can find that it bloats them and makes them uncomfortable. They may have to break up the amount of fiber. I never recommend you cut down on your fiber, but you may have to decrease the amount you're having in one sitting. So ultra-processed foods, avoiding them is helpful, but not the only thing. Caffeine, people having too much coffee or other caffeinated beverages can open up that lower esophageal sphincter and cause acid reflux. So there are lots of other things that can potentially be an issue. Is raw apple cider good for the gut? It's not bad for the gut, I'll say that, but we don't have a lot of scientific evidence that it is actually doing something therapeutic. But you know, it's pretty benign in general. So I say if it's helping, go for it. You remember to dilute it though. Ideally, you should dilute it 1-to-1. Okay. Somebody says no sugar, no red meat, plant-based except for chicken and fish fins do not sit well with me. I try really hard, struggle. Do you mean the vegetables don't sit well with you? If that, I was a little unclear for the comment there, but if that is the case, sometimes if you haven't been eating a lot of plant fiber, what can be helpful is going slowly with it or eating it in a cooked way. So if you're eating like a big raw bowl of vegetables, steaming, sauteing, even boiling, those things, and sometimes a little bit of Beano that has the enzyme alpha-1 galactosidase in it that can help to digest some of that plant fiber can be helpful. Okay, I'm going to stop in just a sec today, but I've had IBS symptoms for nearly a year since having COVID and have increased fiber in fermented foods, but still not back to normal. So good for you. I think that's a really, really sensible start. Is it reasonable to expect to get back to normal eventually? It is, but it does depend a little bit on what the symptoms are. And, you know, while we know the list of long COVID symptoms is long, it's over, I think we're up to over 400 different symptoms right now. You mentioned IBS symptoms for nearly a year since having COVID. So there could be other things that are going on related to those IBS symptoms. I give you an example. A lot of us have been more sedentary during the pandemic. And so if your IBS symptoms, for example, are slow gut motility and constipation, that's something that you could solve, you know, even before the long COVID symptoms go away. So I want you to keep thinking about what else could be causing some of these IBS symptoms beyond just the virus, right? I want you to cast a broad net. But yes, expecting to get back to normal eventually for most people is reasonable. Some people who have a lot of cardiovascular complications of COVID are seeing less reversibility, but for a lot of the other symptoms of brain fog and fatigue and so on, and bowel symptoms, we're seeing good improvement. I am hosting a free antiviral gut masterclass in February. You can sign up for it on robinchutkan.com or gutless.com. And I have some great experts lined up who I've been interviewing who are going to be terrific with explaining a lot of this stuff. Okay. What's wrong with making the smoothie too thick? It makes it harder to get down into the colon. So we want the smoothie, all this plant fiber, to be delivered down to the colon where the gut bacteria can ferment it. And if you make it too thick, it can sort of stay up in the stomach, take longer to go down, make people a little bloated and uncomfortable. So that's that. All right, so somebody says I was eating whole wheat biscuit cereal mixed with grape nuts, but heard Dr. Gregor say that the biscuit cereals were highly processed to get that shape. Yes, this is true. This saddened me, but I stopped eating them. Yeah, breakfast cereal in general, we don't think of as a particularly healthy food, highly processed. Wendy wants to know, do I see patients? Am I taking new patients? I am taking new patients in the new year. So if you check on the website, robinshotkent.com, in the new year, there'll be a page for how to become a patient. And I hope to see you, Wendy. Okay. Oh, I'm so glad you're loving info in all 3 books. Wonderful. Okay. So somebody wants to know, does pregnancy alter gut balance leading to increases in pathogens? I'd really like to know because I've had questions like this in the past. It really depends. Pregnancy isn't necessarily a time of decreased immunity, but we do see women who have autoimmune diseases when they are pregnant, often the diseases will they'll improve. They'll sometimes go into a mild remission. And that's because when you're pregnant, you have a fetus inside you that's 50% somebody else's genetic material. And so in order for your body to not reject the fetus and really have an immune reaction to it, the immune system has to quiet itself down in some significant ways. But the way the immune system quiets itself down to not reject the fetus is different from the way it protects from pathogens. So I wouldn't say overall pregnancy is a time of increased vulnerability. It really depends on overall health, and it depends on what stage of the pregnancy you're in also. Okay. All right. Does the gut health have impact on overall health of a person? What a fantastic question. Absolutely. Remember, Hippocrates said it thousands of years before I did, all disease begins in the gut. So yes, gut health has an impact on brain health through the bidirectional communication between the gut and the brain, the neurotransmitters for the brain made in the gut. It has an impact on immune health because after all, 70 to 80% of your immune system is in the gut. It has an impact on heart health, on bone health, on kidney health, on many different aspects. And that's because our gut is really the engine for our entire body. When you eat the food, the nutrients get processed, assimilated, absorbed through the gut. And the health of the gut determines how well that happens. And so it really has implications for all these different organs. Absolutely, gut health is central to overall health. I'm glad you asked that. Okay. Is there a colonoscopy prep that doesn't have sweetener added to it? Yes, there are a couple ones on the market that don't have artificial sweetener. So do ask your gastroenterologist about those. And, most of the osmotic cathartics do have sweetener added to them. The good thing is that even though the studies show that those colonoscopy preps alter our gut microbiome, those same studies show that the microbiome reverts back to normal in adults in about 2 to 4 weeks. So you're not doing long-term damage, but you definitely want to avoid the ones that have artificial sweetener in them. Okay, so is it possible to take gut bacteria as a supplement? Yeah, just balancing my gut bacteria. We'll do one on probiotics, but what I will say to you generally is that sort of improving, enhancing your microbiome through diet, through foods that are grown in microbially rich soil, through a high fiber diet with a lot of plants, is generally vastly superior to taking a probiotic. But there's some nuances to that. Okay. All right, so we are going to end a little bit early because, as I said, I'm going on a family shopping excursion in a little bit. But thanks so much for joining me, and I will be back next week. And everyone have a wonderful holiday. Take good care. Stay healthy. Stay well. I want you to do a couple things for me. Get outside, move a little bit, and eat some plants. That's what I want you to do for me today. Okay, eat some plants, unprocessed, not a plant-derived food, but actual munch on a carrot. Get outside, even if it's for just a little bit, and get a little bit sweaty if you can today. All right, bye everyone.